So what is the right to the city? It is a collective cry and it is a collective demand. So right to the city was first articulated as that by Henri Lefebvre in the 1960s as a kind of direct result of the social movements and struggles in space that were happening in Paris at the time. But it has since had, I suppose, quite recently there's been a little bit of a renaissance for this idea, and we've seen the idea of the right to the city picked up by grassroots movements and organisations globally. Again, how they're using it is very local, which is interesting. Much as a just city is always going to be situated within a local context, is going to be situated for within local politics, within a set of local needs and relationships. The ways that people organise under this banner of the right to the city, under this collective cry and underneath this collective demand, is also really situated and spatial. The right to the city is an attempt to wrest the use of the city from privileged new masters and democratise its space. It is about access. So when we're talking about the right to the city, we're talking about a few things. We're talking about the rights of all inhabitants of a city to access the features of that city. So Henri Lefebvre was particularly interested in the right to the centre, so the right to being able to access the physical centre of a city. But we can also broaden that out to thinking about things like rights to housing, rights to safety, rights to public space, right to a public realm. We can think about that in terms of rights to energy, right to food. We can think about it in terms of rights to mobility. And we can think about it also in terms of rights to a cultural life, rights to participate in a cultural life, rights to participate in a political life for those who want it. So when there is a collective cry for a right to the city, part of what's happening there is it's a collective demand, a collective cry for access. But the right to the city is not just about access, it's about appropriation. So right to the city, building on David Harvey's idea that if we're all complicit in the production of cities, if it's our labour that is making cities what they are, then we should all have the right to control, to a say over what happens in those spaces. And as a feature of what kind of governs right to the city movements, this idea of appropriation then motivates a whole heap of actions, some of which I'll talk to you about a little bit later. But it's the idea that if the city is not working for you, if it is not working for the purposes to which you need it to be put, then you should change it, that you should physically go out and appropriate the spaces that aren't working and transform them. So the other thing that we need to talk about is what is the city that we're claiming these rights to. So in right to the city kind of discourse, there's the idea that once you claim a right to the city, if we're actually exercising that demand, then that city will be a different city. So the right to the city Brisbane movement is not claiming a right to Brisbane as it exists now. It is claiming a right to the kind of Brisbane that would be possible through claiming the city, which I realise sounds a little bit confusing, but it's basically the idea that in organising and mobilising, we change the city and we change ourselves. And this is a central part of the kind of underpinning philosophy and motivation behind right to the city, is the idea that by changing the way that we produce urban space, we change ourselves. If we connect urban spaces to the material conditions of our lives, then we can change the material conditions of our lives by changing the way that urban space is configured and built. So, very quick summary of right to the city kind of theory and discourse. We think about it in terms of access, appropriation, and transformation. The other really important thing to think about is whose rights we're talking about. Now, typically, right to the city movements do not make claims about citizenship with like a capital C. Usually the argument is that the right to the city is conferred by inhabitants. So if you inhabit a city, that's what gives you the right to it. It's not about whether or not you've got papers. It's not about whether or not you own land. It's not about whether you're a voting citizen. It's not about being a certain age. You inhabit the city, therefore you have a right to the city. The other important thing about it is that it is collective. A right to the city is not something that can be exercised by an individual. An individual right to the city just looks like private property rights, which is absolutely not what we're talking about. This, of course, opens up lots of interesting issues, because how do you collectively organise and collectively mobilise for this right to the city? But this is where we're seeing some interesting experiments, which again is part of what I'm going to talk to you about today. So right to the city movements are always crowdsourced because they are always collective, they must be, and they are also always locally grown. A model for a right to the city movement that works in one city cannot be taken out of context and applied somewhere else. These movements have emerged in many places. They are always collective and they are always linked to space, and they are always using urban spaces to make political concerns kind of material, to give a spatiality to a set of social claims. And of course, that makes them local. So they grow from particular local contexts and issues, whether they're spatial, environmental, or political, and then they reflect those struggles. So the way that Right to the City movements play out is very situated. The priorities, discourse, the aesthetics, the strategies and tactics are all wrapped up in local context, in the emotional geographies of a city and of a community, local politics, conditions and histories and imaginaries. But we're starting to see some of this kind of get stepped up. So there was a recent edition of Raw magazine from earlier this year that was focused on the new municipal movement, which some of you may or may not have heard of. But the new municipal movement kind of leverages a lot of these ideas. It's the idea that we are starting to see in lots of places around the world a refocusing of politics to the city scale. We're seeing people look to their own municipalities as sites for grounded political action and moral authority, as Eleanor Finlay said. So an example of this might be sanctuary cities that are emerging in the United States in response to Trump and anti-immigration policy. So we're seeing sanctuary cities emerge usually through community and neighbourhood groups that are just saying, we're going to protect undocumented migrants who live within our community. We're going to do that. We're going to take a stand. We're going to protect them. We're not going to cooperate. And in fact, we're going to obstruct attempts to deport them. We're also seeing at the level of municipal governments, mayors and councils deciding that they're going to uphold the Paris Climate Change Accord, even though Trump has nixed that commitment. So we're starting to see cities take on roles as kind of political leaders, as sites of political leadership that previously may have been invested in the state or the nation state. And I think some of this might be because for a lot of us, the city makes more sense to us as a political spatial structure. We might feel closer to the city than we do to, some idea of a broader state or some idea of a broader nation. The city is where we live our lives, increasingly so, more and more of us. And perhaps it makes sense to think about politics in this more everyday way that is connected to the physical structures and patterns of our daily lives. So a word on, lots of words on my research approach here. I'll give you the terms of my research approach, but it wouldn't really feel entirely honest because what I'd like to talk about a bit, and I apologise if I am not particularly eloquent about this because it's something I'm still really trying to think through, is that my experience with this project has been of a kind of relational thinking feeling. This is my experience of urban activism and attempting to know and understand urban activism. This is research that is best done by just doing the thing. If you want to know about urban activism, become an urban activist. That would be my tip. But the mode of activism that has emerged in Brisbane right now specifically, the Brisbane moment, it's been called by some, it emphasises relationships in ways that I haven't really encountered before in previous activism kind of spaces. And there's a few reasons for that I'll speculate wildly about. But I think partly is that the intellectual foundation of Right to the City Brisbane is a group called Brisbane Free University, which was started 5 or 6 years ago. The co-founders and organisers of that are Fern Thompson, Bryony Walker and Anna Carlson. And through this project, which is all about taking kind of academic ideas and academic research and often academics into public realms and into public spaces where these ideas are then shared with a broader audience and discussed with a broader audience and contributed to by a broader audience than we typically see. And the kind of organising they used for this project that is very much the kind of the intellectual forebear of Right to the City Brisbane models this kind of relational mode of organising. So it is non-hierarchical. It is a structure of organising that comes through friendship, that comes through care, love and joy and a kind of radical gentleness. Now these things are political. These things are absolutely political. Care is radical praxis under neoliberalism. Choosing to value accessibility and inclusion and smudgy lines is radical under neoliberalism. non-hierarchical modes of organising, even when they can be frustrating and inefficient and challenging, as they sometimes are still radical in our present moment. Kindness is resistance. This is what we're seeing, and this is the kind of praxis that we're seeing. And so because of that pre-existing kind of organisation that had this kind of, I think, kind of cultural shift on activism, I don't know if many of you have participated in kind of, grassroots lefty struggles before, but they can sometimes be extremely hierarchical, extremely cold, and unjoyful in ways that can be pretty alienating. That had certainly been my experience before. But this influence of Brisbane Free University has had a significant influence on the cultural right to the city as it started to form, right to the city Brisbane as it started to form. And so of course has had a massive influence on me and this research. So, yep, I can call this participatory action research. It is that. I can call it insider research. It's also that. I can talk about participants as researchers. I can talk about participatory observation and autoethnography and interviews and co-writing. And these are all things that are happening as part of my collaboration with Right to the City Brisbane. But all of those terms just feel really inadequate for what's actually happening. And I don't want to give the impression, I think sometimes when we do action research, it's the idea of like a knowledgeable academic bringing their expertise to a community and helping that community implement a project or implement a set of ideas where they're kind of carefully planned. I am not an expert on Right to the City. To the extent that I am, it's because I became that through my involvement with this group. I am not an advisor. We're all in it together. We're trying to figure out ways to organise that feel energising and that feel hopeful. We're trying to navigate prefigurative approaches to urban politics, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, that also feel connected and that also feel transformative, or where it seems that kind of transformative work is possible. So drawing on Donna Haraway, Maria Puig de la Bellacasa wrote in a recent book that we can have a kind of thinking with. So she wrote, thinking with and thinking with care, thought becomes embedded in the world that one cares for. She wrote, thinking is thinking with. We cannot think alone. The simplicity can also be read ontologically, to be many or not to be at all. So the only way we can think really is relationally, is in community, in conversation with others. And that itself becomes part of how we constitute ourselves. So that's how I think about this work. I feel like I'm speaking to you today from the worlds that I care for. These are the worlds that I'm thinking with. This is very tricky for an academic and very tricky to make legible to our institutions. And I'd be really happy to talk through those tensions and would love to hear from other people who have or are trying to navigate some of these spaces as well. Yes, but that's a word on method.